Arizona's desert doesn't just bury its dead, it remembers them. Every headstone casting shadows in the heat, every name weathered off forgotten markers, every plot where the ground still shifts when the wind changes direction. You're about to walk through 10 burial grounds where grief didn't end at the funeral, where injustice carved itself into the soil, and where some of the dead have been waiting decades for someone to finally listen. Verified Souls. Tonight we're crossing thresholds most people only visit once, and we're not leaving until you understand why cemeteries don't close when the gates are locked. If you make it through all 10 without checking over your shoulder, prove it. Drop the cemetery name that hit you hardest in the comments, and tell us whether you'd visit it after dark, because your answer says more about what's buried in you than what's buried in the ground. For those who walk these stories with us every week, that subscribe button is your headstone. Mark yourself present, turn on notifications, and let's see if the dead recognize you by the end. Let's begin where thousands are buried but only hundreds are named, and where one woman discovered her ancestor was erased for a reason. I need to understand something before I went digging through those genealogy records. My family doesn't talk about the past, not in that vague we're private people way, but in the specific deliberate silence that settles over the dinner table when someone mentions names from before 1920. My grandmother would change the subject. My father would leave the room. And when I was younger, I thought it was shame, maybe poverty, something embarrassing they wanted to forget. I was wrong. They weren't protecting themselves from the past. They were protecting me from what the past remembered. You need to sit with that feeling for a second because it's the only way to understand why I'm telling you this now, why my hands still shake when I drive past Pioneer and Military Memorial Park in Phoenix, and why I sleep with every light in my apartment burning. This isn't a story about research gone wrong or curiosity leading somewhere dark. This is about discovering that your blood connects you to something that's been waiting 133 years for someone to finally acknowledge what was done to her. And once you make that connection, once you say her name out loud in the place where she's buried, she doesn't let you walk away. It started innocently enough, doesn't it always? I'm a genealogist. I work for a firm that helps people trace their family trees, find immigration records, connect adopted children with biological relatives. It's methodical work, satisfying in its puzzles and paper trails. Last March, I decided to turn that training on my own family, to fill in the gaps my relatives refused to discuss. I started with census records, birth certificates, the usual foundations. My great-great-grandmother Catherine Ashford appeared in the 1880 census in Phoenix, wealthy, married to a prominent banker, living in a house on Washington Street with 3 servants. Then in 1891, she vanished from the records entirely. No death certificate in the family papers. No grave in the plot her husband purchased. Nothing. I found her 6 weeks later in a place that made no sense. Pioneer and Military Memorial Park, the old city cemetery, has a database of burials. 3,700 people interred there between 1884 and 1914, though only 600 markers still exist. The rest are mass graves, unmarked sections, forgotten plots, where the names wore off or were never carved in the first place. Catherine Ashford was listed in Block 32, in the section designated Unclaimed Bodies, 1891. Not in the family plot, not with a headstone. Buried with prostitutes, transients, and paupers, as if she died alone and unmourned. Here's what you need to understand about that discovery. It wasn't just historically wrong. My family had money. Catherine's husband owned the second largest bank in territorial Phoenix. She had 3 living children when she died. There is no scenario, no combination of circumstances, where a woman of her status ends up in an unmarked mass grave unless someone deliberately put her there, unless someone wanted her erased. I drove to the cemetery on a Saturday afternoon in April. Pioneer Park sits at 15th and Jefferson, hemmed in by modern Phoenix sprawl, a patch of desert graves surrounded by concrete and traffic noise. The graves themselves cluster in sections, military veterans in neat rows, pioneer families under weathered headstones, and then Block 32, where the ground is just ground. No markers, no flowers, just caliche soil and scattered rocks marking approximate locations where hundreds of forgotten people were buried together. I walked between those empty spaces, feeling the weight of all that anonymity. All those lives reduced to lists in basement archives, and I tried to find Catherine among them. I couldn't. There's no marker, no indication which patch of earth holds her. I stood there in the April heat with the traffic humming on Jefferson Street, and I said her name out loud. Catherine Ashford, I know you're here. I know what they did to you. And I felt it, a shift in the air, a coldness that didn't belong in 95-degree weather, and the absolute certainty that I was no longer alone in that section of unmarked graves. Something had heard me. Something had been waiting decades for someone to come looking. I should have left then. I should have recognized that feeling, that primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. But I didn't. I spent another hour photographing the section, taking notes, planning my research strategy. I wanted to know how Catherine ended up there. I wanted to expose whatever conspiracy or tragedy had erased her from the family memory. I wanted justice for a woman who'd been dead 133 years. Be careful what you want. Be very careful what you promise the dead. The first object appeared 3 days later. I came out to my car in the grocery store, parking lot, and found it sitting on my hood. A cameo brooch, Victorian era. Carved shell depicting a woman's profile. The clasp was broken. The shell was discolored with age. And I knew, with absolute irrational certainty, that it had belonged to Catherine. I picked it up, and the metal was cold. Far colder than it should have been after sitting in the Phoenix sun. I took it home. I researched Victorian jewelry. I convinced myself I'd bought it somewhere and forgotten, that stress was making me paranoid. The objects kept coming. A hairpin on my doorstep. A piece of lace tucked into my mailbox. A tarnished silver spoon that appeared on my desk at work. Each item Victorian, each item feminine, each item impossibly old and impossibly present. I stopped trying to rationalize it after the photograph appeared. A carte de visite, those small Victorian portrait cards showing a woman in 1880s dress. The face was damaged, scratched away, but the dress and jewelry matched items I'd already received. On the back, in faded ink, Catherine Ashford, 1887. I went back to the archives. I pulled every record associated with Catherine's death. The death certificate listed cause as accidental fall, but the physician's notes, buried in separate files, told a different story. Patterns consistent with sustained ingestion of arsenic compounds. She'd been poisoned. Slowly, deliberately. And 3 months after Catherine's death, her husband Cyrus remarried. A woman 20 years younger, who'd been living in the house as Catherine's companion during her final illness. It was murder. Catherine had been murdered by her husband and his mistress, and they'd buried her as an unclaimed body to avoid questions, to erase her, to prevent anyone from looking too closely at how a wealthy woman died of accidental fall after months of mysterious illness. They'd stolen her life, stolen her name from the family plot, and consigned her to anonymity among Phoenix's forgotten dead. And somehow, impossibly, Catherine knew I'd discovered the truth. That's when the visit started. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean, I woke up at 3:17 one morning to find a woman standing at the foot of my bed. Not a shadow, not a dream. A woman in 1880s dress, her face in darkness, standing perfectly still. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. We stayed like that for minutes or hours. Time felt broken, until she turned and walked through my closed bedroom door. I found a dried flower on my pillow, the kind they placed on coffins in Victorian funerals. It's been 3 months. The objects appear weekly now. The woman appears monthly, always at 3:17 a.m., always standing in places where she shouldn't be. My office, my car, once in the grocery store aisle behind me when I turned around. No one else sees her. No one else finds Victorian artifacts manifesting in their daily life. This is between Catherine and me. This is the bond I created when I said her name in Block 32 and promised to uncover what happened to her. I've written it all down. I've documented the murder, identified the conspirators, traced how Cyrus Ashford's second wife inherited everything while Catherine's children got nothing. I've submitted articles to historical societies, posted the evidence online, done everything I can to restore her name. But Catherine keeps appearing. The objects keep coming. And I'm starting to understand that truth isn't what she wants. Recognition isn't enough. She wants what was stolen from her. She wants the life she should have lived, the burial she should have received, the justice that died with everyone who knew what happened. And I can't give her those things. No one can. So she takes what she can. She takes pieces of my attention, my time, my peace. She takes the certainty that my space is my own. She manifests in my life the way she couldn't manifest in hers. And there's nothing I can do to make her stop because the debt her family owes can never be repaid. My relatives knew. That's why they didn't talk about the past. That's why my grandmother changed the subject and my father left the room. They'd learned that some family histories are better left buried. That some graves are unmarked for reasons that protect the living, not the dead. But I had to dig. I had to know. I had to promise a murdered woman that I'd expose what was done to her. And now she's claimed me. If you're thinking about genealogy research, if you're curious about family mysteries or gaps in the records, I'm asking you to consider something first. Consider whether your relative's silence is shame or protection. Consider whether the past stayed buried because it wanted to be found or because disturbing it has consequences the living can't control. Consider that sometimes graves are unmarked not because the dead were forgotten, but because they were dangerous to remember. I go to Block 32 every week now. I bring flowers. I say her name. I acknowledge what was done to Catherine Ashford. And she appears every single time, standing among the unmarked graves where 3,000 forgotten people are buried together, watching me with that face I can never quite see, waiting for something I don't know how to give her. The genealogist in me says I gave her truth and recognition, but the part of me that wakes at 3:17 a.m. knows differently. Some debts pass through bloodlines. Some injustices mark you just for witnessing them. And some women buried in mass graves have been waiting over a century for someone to finally dig deep enough to wake them up. I did that. I disturbed what should have stayed forgotten. And Catherine Ashford isn't resting now that her story is known. She's present. She's active. She's claimed a descendant to anchor herself to the living world. Block 32 is still there, still unmarked, still holding 3,000 stories that no one remembers. If you visit Pioneer and Military Memorial Park, you'll walk right past it. Just empty ground, just desert soil and scattered rocks. But if you stop, if you really look at that section where the markers should be, you might feel what I felt. The weight of all that silence, all that deliberate erasure, all those people who were buried as if they'd never mattered. And if you're very unlucky, if your blood connects you to one of them, you might say a name out loud. You might promise to remember. You might disturb something that's been waiting generations for someone to finally acknowledge what was stolen from them. Be careful making promises to the dead. They have all the time in the world to collect. There's something you need to know about prisons before I tell you this. They're designed to contain the living, not the dead. Walls, bars, cells, all of it built on the assumption that once a body stops breathing, it stops being a problem. but Yuma Territorial Prison, that brutal stone fortress on the Arizona desert where 111 men died between 1876 and 1909, taught me something different. It taught me that some prisoners never finished their sentences, and it taught me that 104 graves with only one surviving marker isn't a story about theft or decay. It's a story about protection, about the dead defending the only man who earned the right to be remembered. I'm a photographer. I specialize in historic sites, abandoned places, the kind of locations where history feels tangible and the light does interesting things through broken windows. Last September, I got a commission from a regional magazine to document Arizona's forgotten burial grounds, and Yuma Territorial Prison Cemetery was at the top of my list. It's famous in certain circles, this barren plot just outside the old prison walls, where convicts were buried without ceremony, without mourners, their graves marked with wooden crosses that souvenir hunters stole decades ago. All except one. J.F. Floyd's marker survived when the other 103 disappeared, and nobody knows why. That mystery, that single anomaly, is what drew me there. I want you to picture this place with me because the setting matters. The prison sits on a bluff above the Colorado River, stone walls 2 feet thick, cells that baked inmates alive in summer and froze them in winter. It was hell in a landscape that already looked like hell. Bare desert, no shade, temperatures that regularly hit 120 degrees. The cemetery is maybe 200 yards from the main gate, a patch of rocky ground where prisoners were buried in shallow graves, their bodies wrapped in canvas and covered with caliche soil and rocks. No coffins, no dignity. The historical records describe these funerals in brutal detail. No mourners, no tears, no flowers. The dead are disposed of with efficiency and forgotten. That's a direct quote from a 1906 Tucson Citizen article about convict burials. These men died as numbers and were buried as afterthoughts. By the 1950s, tourists visiting the old prison had taken every wooden marker as souvenirs. Every single cross, every name, every indication of who was buried where, stolen. Every grave except Floyd's. His marker ended up in the prison museum, preserved, while the other 103 graves became anonymous rock piles in the desert. I needed to know why. What made Floyd's marker different? What made Floyd different? I arrived at the cemetery just before sunset, that golden hour when the light is perfect and shadows get long and dramatic. The graves are easy to spot, rough piles of rocks scattered across the barren ground, each one marking where a convict's body lies, 3 or 4 feet down. I set up my camera and started shooting, working methodically through the site, documenting each rock pile. The place felt heavy. Not haunted in that Hollywood sense, but weighted with suffering, with the sheer accumulated misery of men who died in chains and were buried like livestock. I could feel it in my chest, this pressure that made breathing slightly harder than it should be. Floyd's area, the museum database indicates the approximate location where his marker originally stood, is in the northeast section of the cemetery. I saved it for last, wanting to capture it in the failing light. When I finally set up my tripod there, that's when things started going wrong. First, the camera malfunctioned, just shut down completely. Fresh batteries, perfect working condition that morning, and suddenly, the screen went dead. I tried my backup camera. Same thing. Both cameras, both dead, only in that specific 10-foot radius around where Floyd was buried. I stepped 20 feet away, and both cameras powered on perfectly. I stepped back toward Floyd's grave, and they died again. Not drained batteries, not error messages, just complete shutdown, as if something was actively preventing me from taking those photographs. I'm not a superstitious person. I'm a professional photographer. I know equipment, I know troubleshooting, and I know when something is mechanically wrong versus when something is impossible. This was impossible, but I had a job to do, so I pulled out my phone to at least get some reference shots. The phone camera worked. Barely. Every photo came out distorted, corrupted with visual noise that shouldn't exist in digital photography. But I could see something in those corrupted images. Shapes, figures, not clear, but present. Standing behind the rock piles. Standing between graves, dozens of them. Here's where you need to stay with me because this is where it stops being a technical problem and becomes something else entirely. I decided to try audio recording instead, to at least document the location verbally. I hit record on my phone and started describing the site. When I played it back 30 seconds later, my voice was there, but so were others. Whispered voices, dozens of them, all talking over each other. I couldn't make out individual words, just this layered chorus of pleading, angry, desperate voices that weren't there when I recorded. I was alone in that cemetery, completely alone. But the recording captured a crowd. I went home. I researched. I needed to understand what made J.F. Floyd different from the other 103 convicts buried there. Prison records from 1906 gave me the answer. And once I knew, everything that happened in that cemetery made terrible sense. Floyd wasn't just another convict. He was wrongly imprisoned, convicted of a murder another man committed, sentenced to 30 years in one of America's most brutal prisons for a crime he didn't do. He maintained his innocence until the day he died in 1906 of heat stroke while working the prison quarry. But here's what made him different. Other inmates knew he was innocent. In the rigid, violent hierarchy of Yuma Territorial Prison, Floyd had earned something rare, respect. When another prisoner tried to kill him in 1904, 3 inmates intervened, and one of them died in the fight protecting Floyd. The man who died was named Thomas Cortez, buried in the same cemetery, his marker long since stolen like all the others. Floyd's grave didn't survive because of luck or accident. It survived because the other 103 dead convicts protected it. Because among all those men buried without mourning or acknowledgement, Floyd was the one who deserved to be remembered. He was innocent. He died defending another inmate. And the dead around him, the forgotten men whose names were stolen by tourists looking for souvenirs, they wouldn't let Floyd's name be taken too. That's why my cameras died. That's why the corrupted photos showed figures between the graves. That's why the audio captured voices that weren't there. I'd walked into a cemetery where 103 forgotten men were actively, consciously protecting the one grave that represented justice in a place that had none. I wasn't being attacked or threatened. I was being warned. Don't disturb this. Don't photograph this. Don't reduce Floyd's grave to content for a magazine spread. This is sacred ground, defended by men who had nothing left but the ability to protect one of their own. I went back the next morning. I didn't bring cameras. I brought a notebook and pen. I stood in Floyd's section and I spoke out loud, explaining what I'd learned, acknowledging why his marker mattered, promising I wouldn't treat this place like just another abandoned site for atmospheric photos. And I asked permission. I asked the dead of Yuma Territorial Prison Cemetery if they'd allow me to document their existence, to tell their story, to give them back the recognition that was stolen when tourists took their markers. The air changed. That pressure I'd felt the night before lifted slightly, like something had been weighing down the atmosphere, and now it was breathing. I took out my phone and tried one photo. It worked. Clear, uncorrupted, perfectly exposed. I took another. I documented every rock pile, every approximate grave, the whole brutal forgotten cemetery. And when I developed the photos later, they showed what the place actually was. Not haunted, not evil, but fiercely protective. The figures I'd seen in the corrupted images weren't there anymore. But in one photo, just one, there was something standing behind Floyd's rock pile. Indistinct. Human-shaped, like someone standing guard. The article I wrote didn't run in the original magazine. They said it was too subjective, too speculative. But a historical journal published it, and because of that piece, the Arizona State Park System approved funding for new markers at Yuma Territorial Prison Cemetery. All 104 convicts will have their names restored. It took 114 years, but those forgotten men will be remembered again. I haven't been back since the new markers were installed. Part of me wants to see Floyd's name carved properly, see all those graves acknowledged. But another part of me, the part that experienced what I experienced that September evening, knows I don't need to go back. The dead of Yuma Territorial Prison Cemetery showed me what they needed, and I helped give it to them. The debt is paid. The protection is no longer necessary. But I think about it constantly. I think about those 103 men buried in unmarked graves, their wooden crosses stolen by tourists who wanted historical souvenirs. I think about how they could have manifested as angry, violent presences, could have defended their forgotten cemetery by terrifying everyone who entered. But they didn't. They only defended Floyd. They only protected the one grave that represented innocence and sacrifice. That kind of selective haunting, that kind of conscious collective action by the dead suggests something that should terrify us more than any horror story ever could. It suggests the dead remember everything. They remember injustice. They remember who deserves protection and who deserves forgetting. And they act on those memories with intelligence and purpose. The 103 forgotten convicts of Yuma Territorial Prison knew Floyd was innocent. They knew his marker was the only one that mattered. And when tourists came to steal that last piece of recognition, the dead said no. They've been saying no for 70 years, protecting that grave, preventing it from being disturbed or stolen or erased. Now their names are coming back. Markers are being carved. The forgotten are being remembered. But I wonder sometimes what they'll do with that recognition. Will they rest? Will the protection finally end? Or will they remain, standing guard over that barren plot where they suffered and died, ensuring that no one ever forgets again what happened in Yuma Territorial Prison? I don't know. I'm just a photographer who went looking for mystery and found something that changed how I think about death, memory, and justice. But I do know this. If you visit Yuma Territorial Prison Cemetery, if you see those rock piles marking graves in the desert heat, show respect. Don't take anything. Don't disturb anything. And if you find yourself standing near Floyd's grave, the one with the restored marker acknowledging J.F. Floyd, who died in 1906, understand that you're standing in the presence of something rare and powerful. You're standing where the forgotten dead chose to protect innocence instead of demanding their own recognition, where 103 nameless men guarded one name because it was the right thing to do. And if you feel that pressure in the air, that sense of being watched, don't be afraid. They're just making sure you understand. Some graves are unmarked because they're forgotten, but some graves are protected because they matter more than memory itself. I need you to look at something with me. Pull up any tourist photo collection from Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone. There are thousands online. People love photographing that famous Old West graveyard with its darkly humorous epitaphs and violent histories. Now, I want you to look carefully at the backgrounds, not the graves themselves, not the wooden markers or the famous names. Look at the backgrounds of photos taken in the old Chinese section, that segregated corner where railroad workers were buried in the 1880s. Look carefully, because in 47 Victorian-era photographs I purchased last year, the same man appears in every single one. Different funerals, different years, different families mourning, but always the same man standing in the background, never identified, never acknowledged, and according to every burial record I could find, never actually buried there at all. I run an antique shop in Tucson. Estate sales, auction houses, private collections. I've built a career finding forgotten treasures and giving them new life. Last February, I acquired a lot of Victorian photographs from a collector's estate, about 200 images documenting territorial Arizona. Most were standard fare, town streets, mining operations, family portraits, but this one collection stood out: 47 funeral photographs from Boot Hill Cemetery, all taken between 1882 and 1884, all showing burials in the segregated Chinese section, where railroad workers were laid to rest far from the white pioneers. Victorian funeral photography was common. Families hired photographers to document burials, to capture that last moment before the coffin was closed and the dead were hidden from sight forever. These photos showed that ritual: Chinese families in traditional mourning clothes, incense burning despite the desert wind, offerings of food and paper money placed on graves according to customs that survived the ocean crossing. Touching images, historically valuable. I planned to sell them individually for decent profit. Then I noticed him. In every single photograph, in the background, always at the edge of the frame, stood a Chinese man in workers' clothing. Same man, same stance, same expression. Over 47 photographs spanning 3 years. At funerals for different people, this man appeared consistently, watching. But he wasn't listed in any of the burial records. He wasn't identified in any caption. The photographer's notes mentioned the deceased, the family members, even the gravediggers, but never him. I'm thorough in my research. It's what makes me good at this business. I cross-referenced every burial record from Boot Hill's Chinese section between 1882 and 1884. 23 men were buried there during that period. Railroad workers mostly. A few laborers from the mining companies, 2 merchants. I checked immigration records, employment records, even contacted historians who specialize in Chinese American history in territorial Arizona. Nobody matched the man in the photographs. He wasn't buried there. He wasn't recorded as living there. He existed in those 47 images and nowhere else. That should have been the end of it. An unidentified mourner, someone who attended funerals but wasn't close enough to the families to be named in records. Boot Hill was segregated, yes. Chinese section, Jewish section, white pioneers each in their designated areas. But that doesn't mean people didn't know each other across those artificial boundaries. I convinced myself he was just a persistent funeral attendee, someone who showed up to honor the dead, whether he knew them personally or not. Then I started photographing Boot Hill for my eBay listings. I needed current photos to accompany the vintage ones, to show buyers what the cemetery looks like now versus 140 years ago. Good marketing. I spent an afternoon at Boot Hill in March, shooting the Chinese section specifically, trying to match the angles from the Victorian photographs. The cemetery is beautiful in its stark way. Wooden markers facing the Dragoon Mountains, narrow piles of stones marking graves, desert sage growing between plots. I took maybe 50 photos that afternoon. Every camera I own, multiple angles, different lighting, professional documentation. When I uploaded those photos that evening, he was there, in 14 different images. The same man from the Victorian photographs, standing in the same positions, same clothing, same watchful stance. Not in every photo, only in shots taken near the Chinese section. Only where those railroad workers are buried. And he wasn't there when I took the photos. I was alone in that cemetery. Completely. Absolutely alone. I deleted the images. All of them. Wiped my memory cards. Cleared my hard drive. Even smashed one camera in a panic that I'm not proud of, but couldn't control. And 2 days later, he appeared in a photo I took of my living room. Just standing there in the background, partially visible through a doorway, watching. Inside my house. I hadn't been to Boot Hill in 48 hours. I hadn't even looked at the Victorian photographs since uploading my cemetery shots. But he was there. This is where most people would run. Burn the photographs, move, change professions, never think about Boot Hill or Chinese railroad workers or Victorian funeral customs again. But I needed to understand. I needed to know who he was and what he wanted, because ignoring supernatural problems doesn't make them disappear. It just means you don't see them coming. I hired a translator to help me research Chinese funeral traditions from the 1880s, specifically traditions surrounding far-from-home burials, because that's what Boot Hill represented for those railroad workers. Temporary graves in a foreign land, way stations until their bones could be sent home to China for proper burial in ancestral ground. The translator found something in historical documents that made everything click into terrible place. In Cantonese tradition, wealthy families in China sometimes hired guardians, men who would travel with workers going overseas, men whose entire purpose was to watch over the living and eventually escort the dead home. These guardians took oaths. They swore to protect the workers, to ensure proper burial rituals, to prevent their bones from being lost or desecrated in foreign soil. It was a sacred duty, binding beyond death. The man in my photographs was a guardian. I'm certain of it now. His clothing matched descriptions of these hired protectors. His presence at every funeral made sense. He was fulfilling his oath, ensuring proper rituals, bearing witness to burials, but according to immigration records cross-referenced with the translator's help, a guardian hired by families in Guangdong province to watch over Arizona railroad workers died in 1881 during the ocean crossing. His body was buried at sea. He never reached Arizona. He never reached the men he'd sworn to protect. But his oath didn't die with him. He manifests at Boot Hill because that's where his duty lies. He appears in photographs because that's how he fulfills the original purpose. Bearing witness, being present, ensuring someone sees and remembers the Chinese workers buried in that segregated corner. He appeared in my photos because I was documenting that section, because I was paying attention to graves most tourists ignore. And he followed me home because I have those Victorian photographs, because I possess the evidence that he was there, that he kept his oath even after death, even after burial at sea prevented him from ever physically reaching the cemetery where his duty called him. I went back to Boot Hill last week. I brought the Victorian photographs. I stood in the Chinese section and I spoke in English, while the translator relayed my words in Cantonese. I acknowledged what he'd done. I honored his oath. I explained that the railroad workers he'd been hired to protect were remembered, that their graves were maintained, that tourists visit Boot Hill specifically to pay respects to all the dead, including those in the Chinese section. I told him his duty was fulfilled. I thanked him for keeping watch for 140 years over men he never met in life. The photographs are still in my shop, but he doesn't appear in new ones anymore. I've taken dozens of photos since that day, of my inventory, my shop, even back at Boot Hill one more time. He's gone from the current images, still present in the Victorian photographs, still standing watch in those 47 funeral scenes from 1882 to 1884, but no longer manifesting in the present. Except for one thing, tourist photos. I've been monitoring Boot Hill's social media tags, looking at photos people post from the cemetery, and he's there. Not in every photo, not consistently, but regularly enough that I notice. Background of a selfie near the Chinese graves, edge of a group shot. Partially visible behind a family taking pictures of Les Moore's famous epitaph. Always in or near the Chinese section, always watching. The guardian is still there, still fulfilling his oath, still bearing witness to the Chinese railroad workers who died in territorial Arizona and were buried far from home. Death at sea didn't stop him. 140 years didn't stop him. My acknowledgement and thanks didn't stop him, because some oaths don't have endings. Some duties transcend death, physical presence, even the basic logic of what should be possible. He's in your photos too if you've ever visited Boot Hill. Maybe you didn't notice him. Maybe he was just a blur in the background, a figure you assumed was another tourist. But if you photographed the Chinese section, If you spent time near those stone-marked graves where workers were buried according to rituals that promised their bones would eventually go home, then he was there, watching, ensuring someone remembered, fulfilling an oath he swore in Guangdong province before he ever left China, before he died crossing the Pacific, before the men he'd been hired to protect even reached Arizona. I still have those 47 Victorian funeral photographs. I've stopped trying to sell them. They're not inventory anymore. They're documentation of something that matters. Proof that oaths can outlive the people who swear them. Evidence that some duties don't end just because death interrupted them. If you visit Boot Hill Cemetery, go to the Chinese section. It's in the older part of the graveyard. Markers facing the mountains. Narrow stone piles indicating graves. Stand there for a moment. Look at those forgotten names. Those workers who built territorial Arizona's railroads and died far from home. And if you take a photograph, check the background carefully when you review it later. You might see him, standing watch, still keeping his oath, still ensuring that someone, anyone, remembers the men he was hired to protect and never reached in life. He's not malevolent. He's not trying to frighten anyone. He's just doing his job, fulfilling his duty, being present the only way death at sea allows. And in a cemetery famous for violent men and dark humor epitaphs, in a town that built its reputation on gunfights and lawlessness, there's something profound about this quiet presence. This guardian who appears in photographs, because that's how he can attend funerals he never physically reached, who manifests across 140 years because oaths don't care about calendars or mortality. Some people guard the living, some people guard the dead, and some people guard the memory of the dead, ensuring that workers buried far from home in segregated graves are never truly forgotten. That's who's in your Boot Hill photographs. That's who's been there all along, patient and persistent, fulfilling an oath that death couldn't break. And he's still there now, standing watch, bearing witness, remembering. Let me tell you how the past claws its way up through what we've paved over. Even when the city swears, there's nothing left underneath. You think when old cemeteries are moved for progress that the job is ever really finished? That's what Bisbee believed in 1914, when they ordered every body in the old Brewery Gulch Cemetery dug up and transferred to Evergreen. A neat sanitary solution to keep the town's drinking water safe from contamination. Paperwork was signed, ledgers updated, city officials made their speeches, and most folks were content to let the dead change addresses without thinking twice. But we all know comfort is built on not looking too close at what we're standing on. I didn't have that luxury. I supervised construction crews for one of Bisbee's big real estate firms. Last summer, they broke ground for a new boutique hotel at the bottom end of Brewery Gulch, the same slope where the Pioneer Cemetery used to be, before the city decided it was a health risk to keep bodies buried above the wells that fed the booming mining district. Historic district, narrow roads, old water lines. We expected headaches. We didn't expect bones, let alone what followed after we found those first coffin fragments. It started like any other project. Orange fencing, safety briefings, backhoes hammering through soil that's more rock than earth. If you've ever seen the hillsides in Bisbee, you know how the layers stack. Dust, then caliche hardpan. Then, if you're digging deeper than any crew wants, cold seams of clay that have held onto secrets for longer than this state's had roads. The first day we breached the 15-foot depth threshold was the day I stopped thinking of the ground as stable. The operator's shout brought us running. He'd crunched through wood, and the smell underneath was all wrong for clean-filled dirt. I knew even before I saw it. Coffin materials, splintered from a century of desert freeze-thaw, and what was left of old, unlined pine boxes. The city inspector tried to stay calm as he called up a representative from the Historical Commission. I ordered the site shut down, But you can't keep word of something like this out of the bars for even an hour in Bisbee. Within a day, people were coming by to tell us stories. How their grandparents warned them never to play near the base of Gulch Hill, about the blocks of stone that showed up in gardens that should have had nothing old in them at all. The official count from 1914 said only adults had been transferred to Evergreen. The reality was different, because what we found wasn't a booted adult skeleton, but the smaller, unmistakable curve of a child's skull. Everyone thinks construction guys are skeptics, that will laugh off the idea of ghosts if we hear it on a job. Wrong. We're the ones who work ground so old it sometimes remembers more than it forgets. We know better. We found 9 sets of remains altogether. Not adults, children. All without names. All wedged close together in one section. Wood so old and powdery it crumbled at the touch. Rawhide strips that must have been once white burial shrouds, and little else. The records listed no such burials. No city stenographer could tell us why no transfer records existed for 9 young graves. The Historical Commission sent in an archaeologist, and the city insisted we stop all work until they could sort out legal jurisdiction. That's when everything changed. The machines didn't just stop working. They broke, one after the other. An engine seized. A hydraulic line burst. A control panel fried so bad, it set off a small fire in the operator's cab. Our tools vanished from locked boxes overnight. Wrenches, hammers, gloves missing. The only things never touched were the items used to exhume the graves, as if something wanted the work completed, but only on its own terms, not ours. Nights got strange after that. Several of my night shift guys quit without notice. They told me quietly, outside the ears of HR and management, that they were hearing crying on the job. Not infants. Older children calling for parents, muffled as if through dirt and wood. Flashlights would go dead. Shadows would flicker where nobody was walking. More than one grown man refused to return, insisting that a child had spoken his name out loud in the dark and wouldn't stop until he ran all the way to the road. I did what any supervisor with a smattering of superstition would do. I had the crew bring in flowers, 9 small bunches of desert wildflowers, and I placed them at the edge of every grave as the sun rose, apologizing aloud for the disturbance. I explained, out loud because it felt right even if it looked crazy to the city officials gathered around, that there had been a mistake in 1914, that these children had been left behind and were now being moved as they should have been, with respect and care. The archaeologist confirmed the oldest bones matched children between 4 and 7 years old. The cause of death was, to her best estimate, fire and smoke inhalation. I made some calls, dug through newspaper archives at the local library, and found it. An orphanage had burned down in the winter of 1913, but the story dropped from the papers within a week, likely because Bisbee's focus was on the mines, not parentless kids. They'd buried the children quietly, without fanfare, on the edge of the old cemetery, hoping memory would cover them, just like Earth. The transfer to Evergreen skipped them. No family to claim them, no headstones to identify them. Finally, the city allowed us to finish the job with proper care. The historian and I led the transfer to Evergreen. 9 unnamed graves, each given a plain marker and a blessing from the local clergy. After the last one was reinterred, the crying stopped. The engines started up again without a hitch. The air, which had held a restless, heavy tension, felt lighter for the first time since we started digging. But I'll tell you this, the sense of being watched never really went away, not for me. I drive past that spot at the base of Brewery Gulch a few times a week. No hotel stands there yet. The land's still for sale. The crew left a small pile of river stones where the graves had been, each painted with a number between 1 and 9, though nobody will claim responsibility for doing it. Sometimes, when I pass at dusk, I see those stones have been moved, lined up in different patterns, as if someone, or something, is counting, checking, making sure that this time, The right number made it safely to the other side. 9 children, lost in an orphanage fire and abandoned underground by record-keeping indifference, finally carried properly to rest. I remember the feeling of that first discovery. The chill more biting than the desert night. The way every word felt like a negotiation with something old and sad as dust. The weight of responsibility settling on your shoulders. Not just to build, but to remember, and to make right what those before us tried to forget. If you walk the edge of Brewery Gulch some night and hear the faint sound of laughter or weeping carried by the wind, leave a stone for them, or a flower, or just a moment of your attention. The city tried to pave over its mistakes, but the ground has a memory, and some things left unfinished keep asking to be counted again and again, until someone finally gets it right. Let me put a question in your mind before I start. Do you ever notice how words linger in places long after their meaning is lost? Not the usual rumors or campfire stories, but actual traces carved into stone that survive generations, shaping how a plot of ground remembers pain. At Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, there's a grave that's marked with what looks at first like a joke, but there's nothing funny about the 4 slugs from a .44 that sent Lester Moore into the earth under the sun-bleached marker where visitors still laugh, pose for photos, and walk away thinking they dodged the curse just by moving on. I'm not here to make you laugh. I'm here to tell you why mocking a grave can stay with you longer than any punchline ever could. It started simple enough. I was out there on a summer afternoon, taking photos for a local folklore guide, Boot Hill's famous for its epitaphs. Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a .44, no les, no more. Tourists love it. You see people snapping selfies beside the wooden cross, quoting the lines, tagging each other in memes, even using it for birthday cards, which tells you more about the American approach to tragedy than any history textbook ever will. But I wasn't just documenting surface quirks. I was cataloging reactions, trying to catch that intangible moment when the living brush up against something resentful in the ground. Picture the heat. Mid-July, the desert radiating up through your shoes, the air tasting of dust and old gunpowder, and every marker casting a shadow you feel between your shoulder blades. I'd watched at least 23 visitors over the course of 3 days. Most lingered in front of Les Moore's grave, some with solemn faces, others giggling, a few narrating faux gunfights for their streaming channels. 4 times I saw a particular thing happen. Someone would take 4 photos in quick succession of the grave, then turn away and find their images corrupted. Not just blurry, but digitally scrambled. Each picture glitched at a different spot in the frame, each one marked as if a bullet had punched through the code itself. When they tried again, everything worked fine. But the 4 corrupted files, never recoverable, always lost. I kept notes. I asked questions. That's when I found the deeper layer. Visitors who owned guns, locals usually, not just tourists, reported something odd after joking about Moore's epitaph. Their own firearms malfunctioned. Not catastrophically, not every time, but always 4 times in a row before returning to normal. Misfires, jams, trigger locks sticking one after the other. Each one described hearing whispers just before the click or misfire. A simple, steady counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Like a voice in an empty room, very close, very patient. History's thin here, but Les Moore's death was no joke. He died in 1880 working a Wells Fargo station shot by a man named Hank Dunstan over a dispute about mail. The street justice was instant. Moore took 4 .44 rounds, Dunstan died in the crossfire, and Boot Hill claimed both within hours. The town was quick to turn Les into a folk hero, and even quicker to shrink the grief down to a punchy epitaph. But local papers from the era, which I read late at night in Tombstone's archives, made it clear. The postmistress wept for days. The townsfolk locked their doors early for weeks, and not a single child came near the grave until the marker was first bleached by sun. The laughter, the dark humor, that came later when the pain was easier to dismiss, easier to package as Old West color. I tested it myself. I brought an old revolver, unloaded, just for the comfort of a medal in my palm, and I stood quietly reading the epitaph. Respectful, acknowledging the tragedy and the violence it represented. Not a thing happened. Then, on a hunch, I laughed about it in front of a friend the next day. In that dismissive tourist way that says, history's dead, let's make it funny. That night, my camera shorted out. 4 images on my phone, ones I didn't even remember taking, all glitched beyond recognition, patterns of static in each frame echoing the shape of bullet holes. My friend, who jokingly mimed shooting a .44 at the sky, reported his hunting rifle jamming 4 times the next morning. And then the counting began, soft in our hotel rooms, whispered under the sound of the fan. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how it grew. A chain of events, subtle and cumulative, not enough to terrify, but more than enough to shape how I thought about respect and death. The phenomenon didn't stop after a week. Even people who didn't own firearms reported experiencing minor electrical failures, small objects breaking 4 times in a row, or glitches with streaming video as they tried to edit their Boot Hill footage, always in sets of 4, always after a laugh at Les Moore's grave. I reached out to Moore's only living descendant, a woman in Phoenix who'd been researching her genealogy for decades. We met in a diner off Interstate 10, surrounded by truckers and copper miners, and she told me flatly, "We don't joke about how Les died. My great-grandmother said the echo lasted for years." She spoke softly about how the town treated Les after his murder, how his widow avoided the cemetery for the rest of her life, how Moore's children grew up carrying the weight of a joke that was never truly funny. "Every generation wants to make it lighter," she said, "but some things get heavier the more people try. There's no threat in this story, not really. Les Moore isn't malevolent, and I don't think the curse is about revenge or harm. It's a message maybe about dignity, the kind that gets trampled when the pain becomes entertainment, when the story gets retold without remembering the violence at its core. The grave doesn't lash out. It just issues a quiet correction. 4 reminders, in digital glitches, mechanical failures, whispered numbers. Each one an echo of the rounds that ended a life in the hot tombstone dust. Before you laugh, pose, or pretend at a gunfight beside Les Moore's grave, I'd ask you to remember this. The real horror of Boot Hill isn't a ghost with a grudge. It's the perpetual loop of tragedy repackaged as novelty. The loss that waits in the ground, counting out its lessons 4 beats at a time until someone finally listens. And if you find yourself alone at dusk, reviewing photos that aren't quite right, or trying to fix things that break in staccato sequence, count softly, respect the silence, and ask what it is you're really laughing about. Someday the ground will answer, and the answer will start from 4 slugs, 1 story, and a grave in Tombstone that never once found humor in the darkness that follows. I want you to try something with me. Close your eyes for just a second and imagine standing in the same spot where 2 different people are buried, separated by 1,000 years, but occupying the exact same coordinates. Not metaphorically, literally stacked. One civilization's sacred ground becoming another's anonymous graveyard, and nobody bothering to check what was already there before they started digging. That's Pioneer and Military Memorial Park in Phoenix, where 3,700 Anglo-pioneers were buried starting in 1884 on land that archaeologists later discovered was an ancient Hohokam village called La Villa. 2 burial grounds, same earth. And in certain graves, at certain times, both worlds exist simultaneously. I work nights as a security guard for the city's historic properties. It's steady work, quiet most of the time, and I preferred the solitude to the chaos of day shifts. Pioneer Park is one of my regular rounds. I check the gates, walk the perimeter, make sure nobody's vandalizing the old markers or using the grounds for anything the city council would rather not know about. It's peaceful work most nights. But there are sections where the peace feels wrong, where the quiet isn't empty but layered, like you're hearing silence from two different eras at once. Block 32 is where it happens most. That's the oldest section, where they started burying people in 1884, before Phoenix was anything more than a dusty territorial outpost with ambitions it couldn't yet afford. The graves there are packed tight, 3,700 people in a relatively small plot, and only 600 markers surviving to mark who's actually underneath. The rest are just ground, anonymous earth-hiding names that weather and time erased. I walk through there 3 times a night, and for the first 8 months of this job, nothing unusual ever happened. Then I saw the double funeral. It was a Thursday in October, about 2:30 in the morning. I'd just finished checking the north fence line and was cutting through Block 32 to reach the maintenance shed. Clear night, full moon, that desert visibility where you can see for miles and shadows are sharp as knives. I noticed movement near one of the older graves. Not unusual. Sometimes homeless folks camp in the cemetery despite the fencing. But as I got closer, I realized I was seeing something impossible. 2 funeral processions occupying the same space at the same time. One was Anglo, 1890s, by the clothing, black mourning dress, horse-drawn hearse, that Victorian formality where grief was performed in rigid ceremony. The other was ancient, native people in traditional clothing I didn't recognize, carrying a body wrapped in woven textiles, moving with a completely different rhythm. Both processions were there, both were real, and both were trying to use the same grave. I stopped walking. I couldn't move, couldn't process what I was seeing. The 2 groups didn't acknowledge each other, didn't interact, but they occupied the exact same coordinates, like 2 photographs overlaid imperfectly. The Anglo funeral was burying a coffin. The Hohokam burial was placing a body in a chamber oriented east-west, the traditional direction I'd later learn they used for their dead. Both ceremonies happened simultaneously, both groups speaking, one in English, one in a language that predated English on this continent by centuries, and both completely unaware of the other. The sound was the worst part. I heard hymns. Abide with me, that mournful Victorian standby, layered over chanting in a language I couldn't identify, rhythmic and complex. I heard the creak of wooden wagon wheels and the soft scrape of stone on stone. I smelled flowers and burning sage, distinct scents that shouldn't mix, but did. And underneath it all, the absolute certainty that I was witnessing 2 realities existing in the same moment. The same space, separated by 1,000 years, but somehow compressed into simultaneity. It lasted maybe 3 minutes. Then both processions faded, not disappeared, faded, like the volume being turned down on 2 competing radio stations until silence returned. I was alone in Block 32, standing near a marker dated 1891, and nothing around me indicated anything unusual had happened, except the lingering smell of sage smoke that shouldn't exist in a cemetery that's been closed for over a century. I filed a report, professional protocol. I described it as possible electromagnetic phenomenon because that sounded technical enough to avoid questions about my mental state. My supervisor read it, made a note in the log, and told me to get more sleep before night shifts. But I started researching. Because if I'd seen what I thought I'd seen, there had to be an explanation. Some documented history that would make sense of 2 funerals occupying the same grave. That's when I learned about La Villa. The land where Pioneer and Military Memorial Park sits wasn't empty when Phoenix settlers started burying their dead, there in 1884. It was an ancient Hohokam village site, occupied centuries before Europeans arrived in Arizona. The Hohokam had burial practices, specific orientations, specific rituals, specific sacred grounds. And when the city established the cemetery in 1884, they just started digging without any archaeological survey, without any consideration that they might be disturbing existing graves. They put 3,700 Anglo pioneers directly on top of a Hohokam burial ground. The archaeological data, which I found in university archives and old city planning documents, showed that several of the Anglo graves in Block 32 were positioned exactly over Hohokam burial chambers. Same coordinates, one grave stacked on another, separated by centuries but sharing the same earth, the same space. And in those specific locations, about 13 graves total that the surveys identified, something strange happens. I wasn't the only one who'd seen it. I found 3 other security reports from previous guards, all describing similar phenomena. Double processions, overlapping ceremonies, the sensation of witnessing 2 different time periods compressed into one visual experience. None of the guards had stayed on the job long after their reports. 1 transferred to a different district. 2 quit outright. I understood why. Because once you see something like that, once you witness proof that time isn't linear and the ground remembers everything ever done to it, you can't walk through a cemetery the same way again. I started documenting the specific graves where this happened. Always the same 13 locations, scattered throughout Block 32. Always between midnight and 4 a.m. Always on nights when the moon was full or nearly full. Something about the light made the boundary between eras thinner, more permeable. And the experience wasn't always funerals. Sometimes I'd see Hohokam daily life, children playing, adults working, the village functioning as it did centuries ago, overlaid on the pioneer cemetery. Other times I'd see only the Anglo era, but with an undercurrent of something older, like hearing whispered conversations in a language you don't speak coming from rooms you know are empty. The most disturbing encounters were when both eras seemed aware of each other. I saw it 3 times over the course of 6 months. Anglo settlers standing at graves looking confused, glancing around as if sensing something they couldn't quite see. And Hohokam people pausing in their rituals, their ceremonies disrupted by presences they couldn't identify but clearly felt. Neither group could see the other fully, but both knew something was wrong, that their sacred space was compromised by an intrusion they couldn't name. I talked to a Hohokam descendant, member of the Akimal O'Odham tribe, whose ancestors were the Hohokam people. I described what I'd seen without claiming it was real, framing it as stories I'd heard. She wasn't surprised. She told me that disrespecting burial grounds doesn't just offend the dead. It fractures the boundary between time periods, that sacred spaces hold everything that's ever happened there, and disturbing one layer disturbs them all. The Anglo graves weren't just built on Hohokam ground. They violated it, broke it open, and created a wound in time that hasn't healed in 140 years. I still work that route, still walk through Block 32 3 times a night. But I don't walk the same way anymore. I acknowledge both burial grounds now. I speak quietly, addressing both the Hohokam dead and the Anglo pioneers, explaining that I'm just passing through, that I respect what this ground holds. And on full moon nights, when the air feels heavy and layered, when I start hearing sounds that don't belong to any single era, I walk carefully. I watch for the double processions, the overlapping ceremonies, the moments when 2 worlds compressed by thoughtless desecration exist simultaneously. The city doesn't want to acknowledge this. Officially, Pioneer Park is just a historic cemetery with some interesting archaeological context. But those of us who work the night shifts, who walk the grounds when the boundary between past and present gets thin, we know differently. We know that stacking burial grounds creates wounds that don't heal, that disrespecting one culture's dead while honoring another's creates a permanent fracture, and we live with the consequences. Watching 2 eras exist in the same space, witnessing the confusion of the dead from both cultures who can't understand why their sacred ground feels so wrong. If you visit Pioneer and Military Memorial Park, walk through Block 32 during the day. It looks peaceful. It looks like just another old cemetery with weathered markers and overgrown paths. But come back at night, under a full moon, and stand still for a moment. Listen carefully. Feel the weight of the air, and ask yourself if the silence you're hearing is really empty, or if it's just too layered for daylight minds to parse. Because underneath 3,700 Anglo pioneers, the Hohokam dead still rest, still perform their ceremonies, still exist in the sacred ground their culture claimed centuries before Phoenix had a name. And in those 13 graves where coordinates overlap perfectly, both worlds remain. Both realities persist. Both sets of dead sharing the same earth, separated by everything except the space they occupy together. What if I told you that death can repeat itself across time and space with mathematical precision, targeting the same name, the same birthday, the same cause of death in different cemeteries across decades, and that pattern is approaching completion? You'd probably say coincidence, pattern seeking in randomness, the brain finding order where none exists. I used to think that too. I'm a data analyst by training, someone who works with probability and statistics, someone who understands that the human mind is wired to see patterns, even in pure noise. But what I found buried in genealogy databases across 4 Arizona cemeteries isn't noise. It's a sequence. And the next iteration is scheduled for October 19th of this year, my birthday, my name. I need you to understand how this started, not with supernatural curiosity or ghost hunting, but with family research that turned into the most terrifying spreadsheet I've ever built. Last January, I was helping my aunt trace our family tree, the usual hobby genealogy that middle-aged people do when they start wondering where they came from. I was searching death records in Arizona territorial archives, cross-referencing names and dates, building that branching family diagram. And I noticed something odd in the search results, a name that appeared 4 times in 4 different cemeteries, all dying on October 19th, but in different years. J. Morgan, Boot Hill Cemetery tombstone, died October 19th, 1879. J. Morgan, Pioneer and Military Memorial Park, Phoenix, died October 19th, 1891. J. Morgan, Yuma Territorial Prison Cemetery, died October 19th, 1906. J. Morgan, Evergreen Cemetery, Bisbee, died October 19th, 1914. Same name. Same death date across 35 years, 4 different locations. My first thought was family connection. Father and son using the same name across generations. Maybe a pattern of tragic coincidence. But the genealogy databases showed no relationship. Different family lines, different ethnicities. The Boot Hill J. Morgan was Irish. The Pioneer Park J. Morgan was German. Yuma was Mexican. Bisbee was documented as Chinese. No connection except the name and death date. Then I checked their birth records. All 4 were born February 11th. Not the same year, different decades, different states before they came to Arizona, but the same birth date. And all 4 died at exactly age 34. I built a timeline, calculated the dates, verified everything 3 times because this couldn't be real, but the data was solid. 4 men, unrelated by blood or geography, sharing a name, birthday, and death date, all dying at the same age in Arizona cemeteries across 35 years. I needed to know how they died. Death certificates from territorial Arizona are fragmentary, but I found enough. Boot Hill J. Morgan, fall from height, accidental death from ladder at mining claim. Pioneer Park, J. Morgan, fell from second-story window, accidental death. Yuma Prison, J. Morgan, fell from guard tower during work detail. Evergreen J. Morgan, fell from mine shaft scaffolding. 4 different circumstances, 4 different locations, same cause across the pattern, fall from height. This is where rational analysis starts breaking down, where the data stops being coincidence and becomes something else. I contacted descendants of 3 of the 4 J. Morgans. Yuma had no living family I could trace. But I found great-grandchildren, distant relatives, people who'd never thought much about their ancestor who died in territorial Arizona, and every single one of them reported the same thing: recurring nightmares, dreams of falling specifically, dreams that started in childhood and never stopped, passed down through generations like genetic memory. One woman in Tucson told me she's had the same nightmare since she was 6, standing at a cliff edge, compelled to step forward, knowing she'll fall but unable to stop herself. Her mother had it. Her grandmother had it. 3 generations dreaming the same death. I started researching the original J. Morgan, the one who had to come first, the template for this repeating pattern. Arizona territorial records go back to the 1860s, and I found him. Joshua Morgan died October 19th, 1863, age 34. Born February 11th, he fell from a cliff near what would later become Tombstone, pushed by a business partner, in a dispute over gold claims. As he was dying, multiple witnesses recorded his last words in their journals. He cursed Arizona territory itself. He said his death would repeat until the land gave back what it took from him, that every October 19th would claim another J. Morgan until the debt was settled. People dismiss dying curses as folklore, as the dramatic last gasps of men who wanted their pain to mean something. But data doesn't lie. Every 12 to 16 years since 1863, an unrelated man named J. Morgan, born February 11th, dies on October 19th at age 34 from falling. The pattern held through 1914, then stopped. No J. Morgans died in Arizona cemeteries on October 19th after 1914. I thought maybe the curse ended, maybe the pattern completed itself. Then I checked the timeline more carefully. The gaps between deaths aren't random, they're increasing. 1863 to 1879, 16 years. 1879 to 1891, 12 years. 1891 to 1906, 15 years. 1906 to 1914, 8 years. The pattern accelerated toward 1914, then went silent. I calculated when the next occurrence should happen based on the average interval. October 19th, 2025, this year. 111 years after the last iteration, the longest gap yet. As if the pattern needed time to build strength for the next manifestation. Here's what made me stop sleeping. My name is Jordan Morgan. I was born February 11th, 1991. I'll be 34 years old on October 19th, 2025. I fit the pattern exactly. Same initials that could be abbreviated to J. Morgan. Same birthday, same age. And I discovered this pattern by researching my own family tree. As if the curse found me through my own curiosity. As if I was always meant to discover this connection. I visited all 4 cemeteries where the previous J. Morgans are buried. Each grave had fresh flowers when I arrived, despite being over a century old, despite having no living family members who would maintain them. I checked cemetery records. No flower deliveries logged, no visitors signed in. Just fresh flowers appearing on graves that should be forgotten. And at each cemetery I experienced the same phenomenon. Overwhelming vertigo. The sensation of being at a great height, even though I was standing on flat ground. The compulsion to look up, as if something was pulling me skyward. The worst was Boot Hill. I stood at the 1879 J. Morgan's grave, and I heard it. A voice that sounded like my own voice, coming from the ground, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Counting the deaths, counting toward completion. And I knew with absolute certainty that I was hearing my own future voice, calling back through time from the next iteration of the pattern. I researched curses, spoke with historians who specialize in frontier folklore, contacted paranormal researchers who study repeating phenomena. Everyone had theories, but no solutions. Curses that target names across bloodlines are rare but documented. Territorial Arizona had enough violence and desperation that dying men's rage could theoretically imprint on the landscape. But nobody could tell me how to break it. Nobody could explain why the pattern chose specific coordinates, specific cemeteries, specific dates with such precision. October is approaching. I've taken precautions, staying away from heights, avoiding ladders, staying on ground floors. But the compulsion is growing. I dream every night now of standing at cliff edges, of climbing towers, of looking down from impossible heights. And in those dreams, I step forward. I always step forward. Not because I want to, but because the pattern demands it. Because 5 J. Morgans before me stepped forward on October 19th, and the curse requires completion. I'm documenting everything. This recording, these notes, the spreadsheets tracking the pattern. It's all time-stamped and backed up to servers that will release the information publicly if I don't check in after October 19th. Because if this pattern is real, if I'm the next iteration, someone needs to know. Someone needs to warn the next J. Morgan, who'll be born February 11th, sometime in the next decade or two, who'll turn 34 in 2047 or 2053, who'll discover this same pattern and realize too late that they're part of it. The rational part of my brain, the analyst, the statistician, says this is pattern seeking and coincidence, that I'm experiencing a self-fulfilling paranoid delusion. But the data analyst in me knows what real patterns look like. And this pattern has held through under 62 years, 5 iterations, 4 documented cemeteries. The probability of this being random is so infinitesimally small that accepting coincidence requires more faith than accepting the curse. Today is October 1st. I have 18 days. I've barricaded myself in a ground floor apartment with no balconies, no stairs, no access to height. But the compulsion is constant now. The urge to climb, to seek high places, to stand at edges. And underneath that compulsion, I hear them. 5 voices that sound like my voice, counting from 5 different graves across Arizona. Come home. Complete the pattern. October 19th. It's almost time. I don't know if I'll survive to make another recording. I don't know if the pattern can be broken or only documented. But I need you to understand something. If you were born February 11th, if your name has the initials JM, if you have dreams of falling that you can't explain, check your family tree. Check Arizona cemetery records. See if the pattern found you too. Because curses don't die. They just wait for the next birthday, the next name, the next October 19th when the debt comes due again. Before you decide whether you believe this, think about the last time a photograph showed you something you know you didn't see with your own eyes. Not a blur, not a lens flare, something deliberate, consistent, like a hand reaching through the image to tap you on the shoulder. That's what this is really about. Not ghosts in sheets, not jump scares. This is about what long exposures at a desert cemetery started to reveal when the camera saw more than the photographer did. I'm a photographer by trade and by obsession. Not weddings, not portraits. I chase places. Old churches, abandoned towns, forgotten cemeteries where the stones lean just enough to tell you the ground has been shifting under them for a very long time. About a year ago, I started a personal project, a series on historic Arizona burial grounds under starlight. Not midday tourist shots, night exposures. The kind where you open the shutter for 30 seconds, a minute, sometimes 5, and let the sky and whatever else might be moving out there write themselves onto the sensor. That's how I ended up in the cemetery just west of Mission San Xavier del Bac, on Tohono O'odham land, south of Tucson, trying to catch the Milky Way rising over adobe walls and white crosses. If you've never been there, you need to feel it with me for a second. The mission itself glows white against the dark. This 18th century Spanish colonial church standing on land that's been sacred to the O'odham people for centuries before any Europeans set foot there. The cemetery lies just beyond. The Tohono O'odham have used a burial ground west of the village since at least the late 1800s. Dusty paths winding between low adobe enclosures and simple wooden markers. At night, the desert goes quiet in that way that isn't silence so much as pressure. A weight of listening, like the land itself is waiting to see what you're going to do. I had permission. That matters to me. I spoke with people from the San Xavier district, explained my project, promised not to publish anything without their approval. This is O'odham land, their cemetery, they're dead. I went in respectfully, tripod slung over my shoulder, camera bag digging into my collarbone, the smell of creosote and dry dust in the air. It was August, hot even after dark, heat radiating off the adobe walls. I set up facing the mission first, capturing the white facade under a sky thick with stars. Then turned my attention to the cemetery itself. Long exposure photography is a strange kind of patience. You compose, you focus in near darkness, then you press the shutter and wait. The camera stares into the dark, unblinking, while you stand there, listening to insects buzz and distant highway noise hum like an ocean you can't see. My first few frames were exactly what I expected. Crosses silhouetted against the sky, faint outlines of enclosures, the mission dome glowing faintly behind them. Ghostly in the artistic sense, not the literal. It was on the sixth exposure that something different happened. I was shooting a north-facing frame, low angle to catch the gravel path that curves toward the oldest part of the cemetery. The shutter stayed open for 40 seconds. In that time, nobody walked through the shot. I'm sure of that because I was standing right there, 10 feet from the tripod, hand on one of the legs, feeling every faint vibration. No footsteps, no movement, just a light wind pushing sand across my boots. But when the image popped up on the back of the camera, there were people in it. Not crisp, not fully formed. More like shapes made of denser darkness, slightly more solid than the night around them. A line of figures walking along the path, heads slightly bowed, all moving in the same direction, toward the northwest corner of the cemetery, where there are no marked graves. I zoomed in, heart pounding. The figures were blurred the way stars are when they streak during long exposures, but there was intent in their posture. This wasn't random motion, like a moth or a bat. This was procession. I told myself it was a glitch. Maybe a double exposure from some weird firmware bug. Maybe my own movement caught oddly. I deleted the frame, stupid, I know now, and shot again. Same composition, same exposure time, same emptiness in real life. Different set of figures. The second image showed fewer people, but they were closer to the far corner, like they'd progressed. One figure was distinct enough that I could see the curve of a shawl around her shoulders, the way her head turned slightly as if she were looking over at something I could not see. No faces, just suggestion. But the feeling that hit me was nothing like curiosity. It was intrusion. I wasn't capturing them. I was interrupting something. I packed up early that night, told myself I'd analyze the files at home. Back at my workstation, under clean LED light, I went through every frame. The first 5 were normal. From the 6th onward, every long exposure that included that path had figures. Always in motion, always heading in the same direction, always converging on that same unmarked patch of ground. I didn't sleep well. My brain kept throwing up rational explanations. Data corruption, sensor noise, pareidolia. But I've spent too many years reading histograms and noise patterns to fool myself. The data was consistent. The noise was structured. So I did what I always do when something feels wrong. I went back. 2 weeks later, different night, different phase of the moon. Still air this time, the sky darker. I set up again, but I changed my approach. I took short exposures first, 1 second, 2 seconds, handheld shots that would show any living person walking through. Nothing. Then I switched to 30-second exposures, camera locked down. The first 3 were clear. On the 4th, they were back. Same path, same direction. I tried moving around. Different angles, different focal lengths. It didn't matter. If the frame included that path and enough of the northwest corner, sooner or later the figures would appear. Always mid-stride, never looking toward me. It was like the camera was picking up a time-lapse of a journey that wasn't happening in my present, but was somehow still playing on a loop in that patch of desert. I stopped thinking of them as ghosts from that point. They didn't have that look-at-me quality you hear about in hauntings. They weren't performing, weren't interacting. They were intent on their own route. I needed context. The next day, I met with an elder from the Tohono O'odham community who has guided tours at the mission and knows its history far beyond what's on the plaques. I didn't show her the photos right away. I just asked carefully if there was anything significant about the northwest part of the cemetery. She watched me for a long moment, then asked where I was from, who had given me permission to photograph, what I believed I was doing on this land. Fair questions. This is O'odham land. The mission was built in the center of an older village called Wake, and the cemetery is theirs, before it is anyone else's. Finally, she nodded and said, "You're seeing the ones who didn't get here." I must have looked as confused as I felt, because she went on. She told me that long before the current cemetery was enclosed, before the mission walls were plastered white, this area had been a place where people in the region were brought when they died elsewhere. Sometimes months after, sometimes after being found in the desert, bones bleached, or after passing in Tucson or beyond. Their remains weren't always recovered. Some never made it back to Wake. Some were buried wherever they fell, with only a prayer said in O'odham and a promise that their spirits would be guided home eventually. She finally looked at my laptop when I opened it and showed her the files. She studied each image in silence, then nodded slowly, not surprised. "They're walking the old way," she said, pointing at the path in the photo. "That's the direction our people would bring someone home from the river, from Tucson, from the east. They walk that way in the stories." You're just catching the stories. We talked about something she called layers, how land remembers, how a path walked in grief and duty over and over can sink into a place so deeply that it never really stops existing, even when the physical footsteps end. How long exposure photography might be less about tricks of light and more about giving those old layers enough time to register. I asked if she thought it was bad that I'd captured them. She shook her head. "Not bad. But don't point a lens at what you don't respect. They're not there for you." I changed how I worked after that. I kept shooting at San Xavier, but I stopped framing that northwest corner casually. When the figures appeared, I treated those images the way you treat someone's private grief. You acknowledge it. You don't broadcast it without consent. I took prints to the community. They held a small meeting about them. In the end, they asked me not to exhibit those specific photographs outside the nation, not as spooky art, not as proof of anything paranormal. Not because they were afraid of them, but because those images aren't entertainment. They're evidence of journeys that are still being walked. So why am I telling you this? Because even if you never see the files, you need to know what a place like that holds. Especially if you ever walk those paths, San Xavier Mission isn't a backdrop for tourists. It's an active church, yes. But before that and beneath that, it's O'odham sacred ground, on a reservation that still asks visitors to treat it with respect. The cemetery west of it is not just rows of crosses. It's a convergence point, a return. A place where people who died far away are still, in some sense, making their way back. Next time you're there, if you go, don't just snap your phone at the white church and the graves because they're picturesque. Stand on the path that curves toward the northwest and listen. Feel how the air settles around you. You might not see anything with your eyes. You might not hear chants or morning songs under the hum of traffic and the rustle of mesquite. But if you've ever lost someone far from home, if you've ever felt that ache that they didn't get to come back to their own ground, maybe you'll sense something. Movement, intention, a line of travelers you're not meant to join yet, still heading toward the place that's been waiting for them longer than any of us have been alive. And if one day you happen to take a long exposure photo there and find shapes in it you don't remember, walking where no one was walking, ask yourself whether your camera malfunctioned or whether just for a heartbeat stretched into seconds, you happened to line up your shutter with a journey that never really ended. If we were talking about this in person, this is the point where I'd lean in a little and tell you that patterns are only comforting when you're not the one inside them. Everything I'm about to lay out sounds like the kind of thing people post on conspiracy forums. Names, dates, maps with red string. But I make a living proving patterns wrong. I'm a skeptic by training, and I still ended up standing in 4 different Arizona cemeteries on the same day, watching the same names stare back at me from 4 different headstones, all tied together by a date that hasn't happened yet. I didn't go looking for a curse that connects graveyards. It found me anyway. You already know I'm a data analyst. What you don't know is that I freelanced for genealogy sites on the side, building tools to help people trace family migrations. That's how I first saw it, buried in an export of unusual coincidences that the system flagged for human review. 4 entries, 4 cemeteries, 4 towns, Tombstone, Phoenix, Yuma, Bisbee, all flagged because they shared the same name and death date across decades. You've heard of J. Morgan already, but when the algorithm spat it out, it didn't feel like a curse. It felt like bad data I needed to clean. The file listed them plainly. J. Morgan, Boot Hill Cemetery, Tombstone, died October 19, 1879. J. Morgan, Pioneer and Military Memorial Park, Phoenix, died October 19, 1881. J. Morgan, Yuma Territorial Prison Cemetery, died October 19, 1906. J. Morgan, Evergreen Cemetery, Bisbee, died October 19, 1914. Same name, same day, different years, different towns. I've seen stranger quirks. Families reuse names. Dates repeat. When you stare at enough records, you get a feel for what's odd but possible and what's something else. What pushed this out of the weird category was a detail the algorithm didn't care about, but I did. Cause of death. Every one of them died from a fall. Different wording on each certificate. Fell from mining ladder. Fell from second-story balcony. Fell from guard tower. Fell from scaffold. But the same core event. Sudden drop. Broken body. Burial within a few days. 4 lives, 4 falls. 4 graves lined up across Arizona like points on a compass. I did what analysts do. Built a spreadsheet. Cross-checked against birth records. That's when the pattern tightened around my throat. All 4 were born February 11th. Different years, different places, but the same birthday. All died at 34. All named something that could be shortened to J. Morgan, James, Johannes, Javier, Gian. Not related. Different ethnicities, different languages spoken at home. The only shared things: name, birthday, age at death, the way they died, and where they ended up. It would have been easy to treat it like a curiosity, one of those statistical anomalies you show your coworkers over lunch. But there was a note in the original log that stuck with me. User reported associated nightmares in descendant line. Someone had actually written that in the feedback field. So I reached out. Not because I believed anything paranormal was happening, but because I'm the sort of idiot who can't leave a puzzle alone. The first family I contacted was in Tucson, descendants of the Phoenix J. Morgan. They thought I was selling genealogy services until I mentioned their ancestor's death date. The line on the other end went quiet. Then the woman I was talking to said, "My mother told me never to go higher than 3 stories. She said our family falls." She laughed after she said it, but it was the brittle kind of laugh that covers fear and old superstition. They'd had 3 serious falls in the last 2 generations, broken hips, shattered wrists, a brother who survived a construction accident by inches. Every time the date was close to October 19th, not exact, but close enough to make you check the calendar twice. That's when I stopped thinking of this as something I could dismiss with a clean conscience. I started mapping it. 4 cemeteries, 4 cities. Boot Hill in Tombstone, where gamblers, outlaws, and victims of Old West justice lie under sun-bleached markers. Pioneer and Military in Phoenix, where 3,700 people are buried but only 600 markers remain, the rest swallowed by time. Yuma Territorial Prison's rocky patch of graves outside the ruined cell blocks. Evergreen in Bisbee, folded into a hillside above a town that still smells faintly of copper and dust. Draw lines between them, and you don't get a neat shape, no pentagrams or perfect circles. But you do get something else, a route. That idea wouldn't leave me alone. A route. Not for the living, for an event, for a fall that didn't finish the first time it happened. I dug deeper into territorial records all the way back before 1879. That's when I found the original. Joshua Morgan, prospector, died October 19th, 1863, age 34, born February 11th. Pushed off a cliff near what would later become Tombstone by a partner who disappeared with the claim. There were witnesses. They wrote down his last words because they were dramatic, and people then were no different than now when it comes to savoring drama. The phrasing varied across accounts, but the essence was the same. If the land took him unjustly, it would keep taking. Same name, same age, same day, until his death was paid back. I could have stopped there, told myself it was just frontier bravado, a curse shouted into the wind by a dying man. Frontier papers loved that kind of color. But the dates on my screen said he got what he asked for, over and over, in 4 different towns that didn't even exist when he first fell. That's when the emails started coming. I'd left a note in one of the genealogy forums asking if any Morgans with February 11th birthdays had strange falling incidents in their family history. I didn't mention Arizona. I didn't mention cemeteries. I just wanted to see if anything pinged. I got 12 replies. 8 were nothing. 4 stopped me cold. 1 from a woman in Flagstaff. Her grandfather, John Morgan, born February 11th, had almost fallen from a fire escape in Phoenix in the 1970s. She grabbed him at the last second. He told her afterward that he'd always known he was supposed to die that way, on that date, but something had gotten the years wrong. Another, from a man in Yuma, who said 3 generations of Morgans in his family had near-miss falls in their 30s, scaffolds, ladders, a canyon overlook. None of them died. All of them talked about feeling pulled forward. You see where this is going, right? The pattern didn't stop in 1914. The hard entries in the cemetery records did. But the attempts didn't. Whatever loop was started with Joshua's curse kept trying to complete itself, lining up names and dates like a bad program that won't stop executing its code until it reaches the final line. 4 successful iterations. A bunch of failed ones. Something interfering. Or someone. I'm not going to lie. This stopped being an intellectual problem and became something else the day I realized my own name fits the pattern. Jonah Morgan. February 11th, 1991. When I first pulled these records, I didn't even think about it. J. Morgan is a common enough name, but once I laid my own ID next to the spreadsheet, once I counted forward 34 years from my birth date and landed on this October, everything that had been abstract snapped into brutal clarity. I did the thing any terrified rationalist does when the uncanny gets too close. I tried to disprove myself, talked to statisticians, ran Monte Carlo simulations using random name-date assignments across the historical population. The odds of this exact alignment happening by chance, same name format, same birthday, same age, at death, same cause, all within one state, were so low that impossible was the word one of them actually used. Not mathematically impossible, but close enough to make the point. So I booked a day off work, got in my car at 3 in the morning, and decided I was going to visit all 4 cemeteries in one day. Tombstone at sunrise, Phoenix by noon, Yuma by late afternoon, Bisbee by dark. Hit every point in the pattern, look each stone in the face, and see if anything changed. I told myself I was collecting evidence. In truth, I think some part of me was offering myself up to whatever loop was running. If you're going to take me, do it where I can at least see you coming. Boot Hill first. The 1879 J. Morgan has no epitaph, just name and dates, the marker leaning slightly, as if it's always in the middle of falling, but never lands. The ground there felt unstable under my boots. Not physically, I checked. It was solid. But my inner ear kept insisting I was on a slope steeper than it actually was. I got dizzy standing still. When I closed my eyes, for a moment I felt wind in my face and the iron taste of dust in my mouth, like I was falling forward into empty air. Pioneer and Military Memorial Park in Phoenix was different, quieter. The J. Morgan there lies among unclaimed bodies, his name surviving by luck in a ledger when his marker didn't. I stood over the approximate spot his remains occupy, traffic noise humming from 15th Avenue, and felt nothing at first. Then this double sensation, like my body was both upright and horizontal, like my consciousness couldn't decide if it belonged to the one looking down or the one looking up from under 6 feet of soil. I lasted maybe 2 minutes before I had to leave. Yuma was worst in terms of pure physical reaction. The prison cemetery is nothing but rock mounds baking under the sun. The 1906 J. Morgan is one of many anonymous convict graves there, his original marker long gone. As soon as I stepped between those rock piles, my knees wanted to give way. I had to fight an almost overwhelming urge to drop to all fours and crawl, like standing upright was an insult to something in that ground. My phone, my watch, even the rental car key fob all glitched for exactly 19 seconds, long enough for me to notice and time it. Then everything went back to normal. By the time I got to Evergreen and Bisbee, the light was going. Steep hills, copper tailings glowing faintly in the last sun, and the cemetery terraced into the slope. The 1914 J. Morgan is near one of the older sections. Standing there, I didn't feel like I was falling. I felt like I was at the bottom of a fall that had never really ended, like impact was still in progress, stretched across time, waiting for the final body to hit. Here's the thing that truly shifted this from fear to something like resignation. At each grave, I found fresh flowers, not elaborate, just simple bundles. Desert wildflowers at Boot Hill, a grocery store bouquet in Phoenix, a plastic rose at Yuma, a single white carnation at Bisbee. No visitor signatures in the logs. No obvious family activity. Just these quiet, persistent notes of attention. I touched the one in Bisbee and felt unmistakably the slight warmth of a hand that had been gripping the stem not long before I arrived. On the drive back, the rational part of me tried one last time to take control. You're tired. You primed yourself for all of this. It's cognitive bias stacked on coincidence, stacked on heat stroke. But then my GPS, which had been fine all day, recalculated my route without me touching it. The new path it drew on the screen. It traced almost exactly the same line I'd mapped on my wall at home, the 4 cemeteries in order. And at the center of the state, where no J. Morgan has been buried yet, it pulsed a little blue dot at a set of coordinates I didn't recognize. I looked them up when I got home. Empty desert, state trust land, no cemeteries, no recorded structures. Just a patch of Sonoran earth that, when plotted alongside the others, formed the midpoint of every line connecting those graves, the hub of the pattern. The place, if you believe my own terror logic, where the fall actually ends. So that's where I'm headed on October 19th. I know how that sounds. Believe me, no one hears the insanity in that sentence louder than I do. But every attempt the pattern has made on another J. Morgan since 1914 has failed. Someone grabbed a wrist, a rope held. A handrail didn't give. Whatever is trying to finish what started with Joshua's curse hasn't succeeded in over a century. And I keep thinking, what if it's because the endpoint, the final resting place, the right coordinates, are somewhere else entirely? What if the only way to stop this from constantly reaching for the next J. Morgan is for one of us to go where it's actually been aiming all along? Maybe it'll be nothing. Maybe I'll stand in the middle of a cactus-studded plain, feel the sun on my face, and go home embarrassed, ready to delete a dozen voice memos and tear down the string map on my wall. Or maybe I'll finally see the shape that's been casting these four shadows across Arizona burial grounds for 150 years. Maybe I'll feel that pull forward again stronger than ever. Either way, I've left instructions. If I don't make it back, the data goes out. Names, dates, locations, a warning label on the future. Because if this pattern doesn't end with me, it'll start looking for the next J. Morgan, the next February 11th baby, the next 34-year-old standing too close to an edge on an ordinary day that happens to be October 19th. And I can't live with the idea of someone else stepping into this blind. So I'm walking toward the center of the map, toward the point where 4 cemeteries, 5 deaths, and a curse spat into desert air started intersecting long before anyone thought to draw lines between them. If I come back, maybe I'll finally be able to say it was all coincidence. If I don't, well, then the pattern finally resolves. And maybe, just maybe, those flowers will stop appearing on old graves. And a certain date will go back to being just another day on the calendar. If you were sitting across from me right now really looking at my face, you'd see it. The exhaustion that isn't from lack of sleep. It's from trying to decide which dead deserve to be remembered and which are begging to disappear. That sounds wrong, doesn't it? We talk so much about never forgetting, about preserving history, about saving every name from being lost. But after 36 years, volunteering at Pioneer and Military Memorial Park in Phoenix, carefully tending 600 markers for the 3,700 people buried there, I can tell you something nobody wants to hear. Not every grave wants to be restored. Some are fighting back. I started this work in 1988, the year the city finally stopped pretending those 7 old cemeteries downtown didn't exist. For 74 years, since 1914, when Phoenix banned new burials inside the expanding city limits, this place was left to rot. Headstones toppled, iron fences rusted, teenagers partied between the graves, and the desert tried to reclaim what had been taken from it. Then a preservation push began. The burial grounds were renamed Pioneer and Military Memorial Park. The Pioneers Cemetery Association formed, and a handful of U.S. fools with soft hearts and strong backs started the slow, careful process of bringing order back to the chaos. I fell in love with it. Cataloging markers, tracing faint names with my fingers, cross-checking old city records to match anonymous bones with identities, planting drought-tolerant flowers where families no longer came. We knew there were about 3,700 burials here from 1884 to 1914, but only 600 markers remained. Every stone we reset felt like rescuing someone from a second death. It was good work, holy work, in its way. At least, that's how it felt for the first 10 years. Then I noticed the 13. You might think that sounds dramatic, the 13, but there's no other way to say it. Out of hundreds of graves I've worked on, there are 13 that will not stay fixed. 13 that resist every effort, however gentle, to bring their names back into the light. Markers that won't stay upright. Letters that erode faster than any stone around them. ground that refuses to hold anything driven into it. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Bad concrete. Shoddy 19th century workmanship. But you can't catalog a place like this as long as I have without learning to separate accident from intention. The first was in Loosely Cemetery, one of the sections within the park. I reset that marker 4 times over 6 months. Same routine as always. Cleared the base, level the soil, clean the stone, stabilize it with an unobtrusive support. Each time I'd visit the next week, it would be leaning again, just a little more than the usual desert sag. Then one morning, I found it face down, the supporting pins bent backward like something had pushed from the front, not pulled or toppled from behind. I checked for vandalism. We've had our share over the years. Kids knocking things over, drunks thinking they're funny. But there were no scuff marks, no footprints in the dusty path, no sign the fence had been climbed. It looked like the stone had decided all on its own that it wanted out of the upright world. I documented it, reset it, chalked it up to bad luck. By the time I noticed the 3rd and 4th behaving the same way, in different sections, different corners of the park, I started a list. 13 entries scattered across Block 32, Porter, Loosely, Rosedale, and the old military section. Different families, different years, men and women, not clustered the way you'd expect if it was a soil issue. I logged every repair, dates, techniques, weather conditions, and every time within weeks, those same 13 would slump, crack, or fall while the markers around them stood firm, through monsoon storms and summer heat that made the marble too hot to touch. The names, I'm not going to give you all of them. That feels wrong, for reasons that will make sense in a moment. But I'll tell you the patterns I found when I finally went beyond the stones and dug into the records. We have copies of old burial registers. Some fragile originals still exist in the city archives, crumbling logbooks full of ink blots and looping 19th century script. I requested access and started pulling everything tied to my 13 problem graves. Cause of death, occupation, next of kin, court records, when I could find them. What emerged wasn't immediately obvious. No shared epidemic, no mining disaster, no common profession. Then, on a hot afternoon when the reading room AC was losing the battle against July, something clicked. Every one of the 13 had done something they were never punished for. A shopkeeper who disappeared after a fire that killed his business partner, and 3 workers trapped in the back room. A midwife, rumored, never charged, to have quietly ended pregnancies for women who couldn't afford scandal. A former cavalry officer with accusations of massacres against Apaches and Yavapai in his service record that were investigated and dropped. A man whose first wife was listed as deceased months before he married the second, though there was no death certificate for the first anywhere in territorial records. A woman who outlived 3 husbands, each with oddly favorable life insurance payouts that stopped abruptly when she died of heart failure at 43. No convictions, no jail time, no formal acknowledgement beyond whispers and side notes in city council minutes. They died with their reputations technically clean. The stones I was trying to stand back up were monuments not just to their bodies, but to secrets they'd carried to the grave, or thought they had. I know how this sounds. Old woman with too much time on her hands invents stories about the dead. But I'm telling you, the difference between the 13 and the hundreds of other graves that have responded gratefully to restoration is palpable. When I work on most stones, there's a lightening, a softening in the air. Call it imagination if you like, but the place feels gentler. When I work on those 13, the air gets heavy. My tools slip. I nick my fingers on edges I've traced 100 times. The letters refuse to hold chalk. Names I restore one week are all but unreadable by the next, as if the stone is weathering decades and days. The dreams started in my 15th year of service. At first, I thought it was just my mind processing the archives, the shopkeeper, the midwife, the soldier. But the timing lined up too neatly. Every time I spent a day battling one of those 13 graves, I'd have a nightmare that night. Not of ghosts chasing me, not of horror movie apparitions, of ordinary people sitting across from me in the visitor center, hands folded, eyes hollow. "Leave it," they'd say. "Let it fall. You don't know what you're doing, putting us back up like that." I'd wake up with my heart pounding and the taste of dry earth in my mouth, the way it smells when a dust devil has just passed. More than once, I woke with dirt under my fingernails when I hadn't been near the park in a day. I started skipping those 13 when I could, prioritizing other markers. The dreams eased when a new volunteer came on and, full of good intentions, tackled one of the problem stones on their own. They'd show up the next week with haunted eyes, saying they'd had weird nightmares about guilty people begging them for anonymity. You can argue suggestion, placebo, contagion of ideas. I would have too, 20 years ago. But there's a line between superstition and learning to listen to what a place is telling you. Pioneer Park is full of grief, yes, but most of it wants to be witnessed. Most of it reaches up when you brush dirt off a name and lets you feel just for a second the relief of being known again. These 13, they flinch from the light. They twist away. They are not proud of what they represent. About 5 years ago, after one particularly bad summer of monsoon winds, knocking 2 of the 13 flat again and again, I did something I never documented in the association minutes. I stopped. Not entirely. I still keep the ground around them tidy. I still clear weeds, mend divots, make sure no one trips over fallen stone. But I no longer try to make those markers stand no matter what. I no longer fight the earth every time it swallows another letter of their names. I took it to the board in a roundabout way, framed it as prioritizing limited restoration funds for stones that respond well. They agreed easily. Budgets are thin. They didn't need to know that I was also acting on advice, because the dreams changed. The pleadings turned to something like gratitude. Not from all of them. Some of the 13 stay stubbornly silent, but from enough that I woke less often, with that crushing sense of having forced someone into unwanted visibility. I started feeling like their caretaker, not in the sense of polishing their reputations, but in guarding the last bit of obscurity they'd chosen for themselves. Do I think the dead have opinions about this? After all these years, yes. I think the ones who did their best and were forgotten crave restoration. I think the child buried under a stone that only ever read baby is desperate for someone to say, "You were here, you mattered." I think the veterans and mothers and miners and midwives who lived honest, hard lives deserve every scrubbed clean letter we can give them. But I also think there are people buried here who went to their graves, relieved that history wouldn't remember the worst of them. And something in the mechanics of this place, call it energy, call it consequence, call it the weight of unpunished acts, fights me every time I try to work against that. If you walk Pioneer and Military Memorial Park on a Sunday tour, you'll see the success stories. Beautifully restored obelisks, white marble crosses rescued from the weeds, military markers scrubbed and recentered over their occupants. You won't notice, unless someone points them out, the 13 that lean a little farther than they should, or whose names are inexplicably faint compared to neighboring stones of the same age and material. We don't draw attention to them. That's not cowardice. That's respect of a different kind. There's a phrase people like to use in preservation circles, saving history. I used to love it. Now it sits wrong in my mouth. We're not here to save all of history. Some of it is poison. Some of it burns everything it touches. Our job is to tend the garden of memory, trim where we must, cultivate what deserves light, and understand that not every plant should be forced back into bloom. So when you visit someday, and you should, if you're the kind of person who listens to stories like this all the way through, wander the rows. Read the names that still stand. Touch gently the stones leaning into the earth. If your fingers trace letters that seem to fade even as you follow them, don't press harder. Don't try to force clarity. Step back. Offer a nod, a moment of silence, and walk on. Some people spend their lives dodging consequences. Others have to lie awake for years, like I do, negotiating with the weight of what they left behind. Between us, somewhere in the middle of Block 32, under the relentless Phoenix sun, are 13 graves that refuse to cooperate with the story we want to tell about remembrance. I used to think my job was to fight that. Now I know better. My job is to listen.